All right, guys. So topic 11. Topic 11 is about purchasing and the strategic sourcing. Most of you probably have heard of these two terms, but really, what is purchasing and strategic sourcing? When we talk about this, a common image that comes to mind is basically shopping, but at a corporate level. Now, unlike how we shop for ourselves, when it comes to purchasing and strategic sourcing, you're actually buying for other people. So think of you're buying a gift for a friend or someone entrusting you with buying dinner. Sometimes buying dinner could be as simple as making a run to Taco Bell, but other times you have a friend with a long list of food allergies. Then your purchasing decision would be a lot more complicated. So let's take a look to see just what it entails. With purchasing, there are basically 7 rights. You need to buy the right stuff at the right amount, at the right time, get it to the right place, from the right supplier, with the right service, at the right price. So there are a lot of rights. A purchasing manager's responsibility is to strike that proper balance among all 7 of these. So think of it as simultaneously having to balance 7 different demands. And a lot of these demands are placed by different functions within the company. Some of them might be logistics. Logistics would care about the right time and the right place. For operations, they might care about the right material and the right service. Legal department might care about the right supplier. That's increasingly important in today's political climate as the Trump administration continues to raise trade wars against U.S. trading partners. And finally, there's the right price. Again, the right price it sounds simpler than it really is, because it's not as simple as say for us to go to Walmart, to go to Kroger and see a price tag on the shelf. Oftentimes there are factors involved, most recently of which is the concept of tariff. So one of the tried and true and the most important concepts in sourcing is the strategic sourcing matrix. A strategic sourcing matrix is basically determined by either the importance of category along with the complexity of the market. So just if you take a look at your computer, for instance, the keys on your laptop, they're basically plastic squares. They're very common. The number of companies that can make your keyboards probably far outstrip the number of companies that are capable of making the LCD screens. And in turn, the number of companies that can make your LCD screens are going to be slightly more common than the number of companies capable of making, say, the memory chips. And finally, the least common supplier for all the components in your PC laptop is probably the CPU, as well as central processing unit, as well as the graphic processing unit. So most likely, your computer uses an Intel CPU, and most likely your graphic processing unit in your laptop is either an Intel integrated graphic processing unit or a discrete NVIDIA GPU, possibly AMD Advanced Micro Devices GPU. But that's about it, guys. And so what I'm basically getting at here is that if you, based on all those components I just talked about, keys on your keyboard, very simple to make, complexity of the market is very low, and it's probably not all that important to the laptop. And so your keys will be purchased on a routine basis where you purchase only as many as you needed. But then on the polar opposite side, where your central processing unit really comes down to one of two companies, Intel or AMD. And it also happens so that your CPU is probably also the most expensive unit most expensive component inside your laptop. So highly complex market with a lot of patent protected, hardware compatibility along with software compatibility. It's highly complex, and you'll have it's a very expensive component to boot, and so naturally it will be a critical component. So everything else that follows is based on these two concepts. If you look at determinants of supply market landscape, the example we just used, are there many suppliers or only a few? Well, in the case of CPU, Intel and AMD are it, so only two suppliers. If you want to go to the go extreme, a patent-protected cancer drug has just one supplier. Can new suppliers enter the market easily? It depends on how much capital investment is required. So for instance, the world is now down to pretty much Boeing and Airbus as the two manufacturers of major large-scale passenger jets. Regional jets, we have basically Bombardier in Canada and Embraer in Brazil. Intel and AMD are the two manufacturers of CPU. The reason why passenger jets, regional jets, short-haul regional jets, and central processing units, you basically have global duopolies, is because capital intensity for these markets are so high that suppliers cannot enter the market easily. And then you got to look at, are suppliers bigger, smaller, or about the same size as your company? This directly determines your bargaining leverage. So for instance, any one of us cannot walk into Walmart and try to demand some price breaks from Walmart because, well, with Walmart prices, you take it or leave it. There's no room for negotiation. Same thing applies in purchasing. And then there are risks. How important are you as a customer? If you're not very important, then you can bet the supplier is not going to care about you. Who else buys the same material? Sometimes the buyers of the same material is actually in a different division from the same supplier. So if you look at Samsung, Apple buys the LED AMOLED screens for iPhones directly from Samsung, and Samsung's mobile handset division also buys the same material from Samsung. And so if you have a lot of customers, a lot of companies buying the same component as you are from the same supplier, then it reduces your importance as a supplier. So now we're seeing that these things are tied together. And then technological uniqueness kind of ties to supply market landscape as well. If you have a component that is patent protected, in the case of a pharmaceuticals company, if they have a patent on it, then they're the sole manufacturer, sole supplier of that drug. And again, it increases complexity. So when it comes to strategic buying priorities, based on the strategic sourcing matrix, a buyer, a procurement manager deals with them differently. With routine, because there's so many suppliers available and you only need them, you only buy them on an as-needed basis. You try to minimize the fuss with your purchasing process, make it simple, make it inexpensive. With leverage, this is where, for instance, if you're Coca-Cola, then you would probably be buying a lot of plastic bottles. And plastic bottles, even though you're buying high volumes, but they can really be purchased. It's not technologically sophisticated, it's not patent protected, and so you can try to pit suppliers against each other. You can either try to get them to outbid each other for lower prices, or you can try to consolidate your buys with a single supplier to take advantage of bulk quantity discount. Now, as we shift to bottleneck and critical, this is where supply market becomes more complex, where you only have a few options. The way you treat these two categories are somewhat similar in that in both instances you want to maintain relationships, except the goal of your relationship is different. With bottleneck, the goal of your relationship with the supplier is simply for to preserve volume. You want to make sure that you have a steady supply of products coming in from a bottleneck supplier. On the other hand, with critical or strategic, you want to invite the suppliers to basically become an extension of your company. The auto industry is very good at this. Industrial equipment, industrial machinery, very good at this. John Deere even invites suppliers into the factory to make suggestions for John Deere to modify their tractor design in order to better incorporate new components from suppliers. So with all of this said, the strategic sourcing process itself is fairly simple. It's actually pretty common sense. You got to recognize what needs there are, and usually the information is passed along to you by an internal function such as marketing, such as operations, such as R&D, to tell you what they need. And then, based on that, purchasing would send out something called a request for a proposal, RFP, to suppliers. And among the suppliers that are actually qualified, purchasing would once again send out another form called RFQ, request for quotes. So you source it, and then you determine what is the optimal form of engagement, contracting process. Do you want to simply set up a competitive bid? Do you want to buy something off the shelf? Do you want to engage in negotiation? The strategic sourcing matrix determines what form you engage in. And finally, you actually procure it, you buy it, and then you reconcile what you purchased or with what you received with what you're being billed for, and then you pay it. This process is called the triple matching process. So you pay the invoice. Typical payment terms in a business-to-business setting include 15-day payment terms, 30-day, 45-day, usually in increments of either half a month or 2 weeks. So when it comes to bidding versus negotiation in a contract, as I already mentioned earlier, how do you actually purchase the product? You see here it's driven mostly by the strategic sourcing matrix, as I mentioned earlier. With routine items, you buy them off the shelf, buy at a list price. Leverage items, competitive bidding to make sure that your high volume buys are billed with lowest price. With strategic bottleneck items, this is where you want to negotiate because you care about the relationship. So speaking of relationship, generally all business-to-business relationships fall somewhere in between the spectrum as anchored by transactional and strategic. With transactional, the way you can think about this is like, most of you have Facebook accounts. These are your Facebook buddies, Facebook friends, right? Facebook friends, they're there, you're connected, you rarely interact with them, you probably send them a birthday message every now and then, but really that's about it. The relationship goal with your transactional relationship is to minimize cost, assure availability. So drawing an analogy to your Facebook friends, you minimize the amount of attention you invest in the relationship, but at the same time, as long as they stay a Facebook friend, they're available as a friend in the event that you choose to contact them. So of course, the nature of transactional relationship is you have very low value co-creation potential because you guys don't interact. The relationship is arm's length, so you guys aren't all that close, and sometimes the relationship could fade in and out. Maybe your Facebook friend with whom you haven't interacted in a couple of years would go through the friend list and start unfriending people with whom they haven't interacted. So you might become one of those casualties. Same thing applies in a business-to-business transactional relationship. On the polar opposite, this would be the strategic alliance. These would be your very, very close friends, the people that you probably grew up with, go on party with, have study sessions with. You guys may even exchange job interview tips if you apply for the same job. The point here is with the strategic alliance, you're trying to maximize value co-creation. So you with one such friend applying for the same job, you guys probably sit down and exchange interview tips, thus maximizing both of your potential at landing a particular job. And so with the high value co-creation potential, you guys probably are interdependent, where one of you may owe the other person for some amount of money, but you're not all that concerned. But at the same time, you know that there's that potential that you can depend on this person for owing favors or doing favors and such. The relationship with this alliance tends to be long term, and so for a night out, you guys would jointly plan to say, we're going to hit up the following bars, or we're going to go to the following places. You guys might even be roommates, share resources along with risk and rewards. That's security deposit. So strategic alliances and transaction relationships analogous to best friends / roommates versus simply Facebook friends. So as you work with, as you start to classify different suppliers based on importance, there's something called supplier integration, where you treat your suppliers basically as an extension of your own company. There are some programs here that basically span from basic levels of integration to maximum integration. So basic levels, you have collaborative forecasting, where the supplier and the buyer come together to try to determine jointly what is a future demand looking like. So this way, the supplier knows how much to produce without overproducing or underproducing, so that you, the buyer, can be assured of a certain volume of product. But that is a very basic level. With vendor-managed inventory, think about the last time you guys went to a Kroger or Walmart. You guys might have seen a Pepsi representative or a Frito-Lay representative inside the store, stocking the shelves and building in-store displays. And so in this instance, we're starting to see that the supplier is acting on behalf of the buyer to take on some of the responsibilities, such as stocking shelves, that would otherwise have traditionally fallen on the buyer company itself. And then you have in-source warehousing, where the supplier goes beyond simply managing inventory, but actually manage a warehouse. So with early supplier involvement and supplier integrated in manufacturing, this is where we incorporate suppliers to become even more important in having direct influence on product designs. So for instance, with the John Deere example I mentioned earlier, John Deere actually invites, say, suppliers of their mechanical engines to help them to co-design products. Another good example, Google and LG, as well as Google and HTC, Google and Huawei, all of these relationships involve Google sitting down with these phone manufacturers to design a new line of devices. So supplier integrated manufacturing. So other types of integration, I just went through this. So again, the examples I gave you basically illustrates all of these definitions. Now, early supplier involvement in your new product development is a little bit interesting here, in that with new product development, you generate ideas all the way to launch. Each step along the way, supplier can inject themselves to help the company to understand the new product, either the potential market, or the manufacturing process. And the whole idea is that involving a supplier throughout the new product development process would increase the potential success of the project itself, based on both the ideation aspect of it and the capacity for support aspect of it. That's the reason why Google went to LG, HTC, and Huawei for product design and new product launch process. So we're going back to multi-criteria analysis that we've used before when it comes to a network selection. It's basically the same thing as a location decision analysis, except when applied to a purchasing context, it is more about you identifying and evaluating suppliers. So the same four guidance applies here: intuitiveness, quantifiability, applicability, and discipline. So this should look pretty familiar to you guys, because instead of Buckeye, Razorback, Red Hawk, Spartan, and Volunteer, the previous multi-criteria analysis example here was China, Japan, Mexico, and so forth. But the idea is basically the same. You determine what are the most relevant supplier selection criteria. Obviously you care about quality and cost, but increasingly sustainability, delivery responsiveness, financial stability is huge. If you're for a critical component supplier, you don't want the supplier to go out of business. And then relational potential, how much potential there is for you to co-create value. And so same thing applies here. Once you determine the factors that are relevant, you assign the weights based on how this component fits under the strategic sourcing matrix. And then you have supplier potentials, supplier A, B, C, D, and then you try to objectively assign a score for quality, cost, and so forth with every single supplier. In the end, you multiply the weight by each trait, have them summed up at the end to derive an objective supplier score. And again, your initial rating, your initial weighting system may not be your final, because as managers, we all have a rough idea based on our working history. For instance, Buckeye had been our most preferred supplier in the past, and yet it shows here Red Hawk comes out at a higher score. So then as a manager, you start to think, well, that's not what my anecdotal experience says. And so I'm going to go back to both my history working with Red Hawk and Buckeye to see what was the difference. Why was it that I preferred to work with Buckeye when Red Hawk objectively shows as the better of the two suppliers? So maybe my weighting system is inaccurate. Perhaps Red Hawk may have lower cost, but there was greater value creation potential with Buckeye. And so perhaps I need to readjust my weighting system to reflect my true underlying preferences when it comes to supplier selection. So the make versus buy decision is huge in purchasing, because this basically determines outsourcing versus insourcing. Most companies here in the US have steadily shifted manufacturing to an outsourcing format, but only those components that are routine and leverage. And that is in part because with routine and leverage components, you have a large number of suppliers already out there. And so they may be able to specialize in that one item, do it better for lower price than you could do it in-house. And so what it really comes down to is the item or service strategically important? And when you think strategy, it is always critical. So if it is not critical, then you consider outsourcing. If it is critical, then you look at, are we actually any good at it? If my company is not good at something that is strategically important, then now I have to think about if my organization can actually improve it to make it something that we can do successfully. If not, then can a supplier do it better than your organization? And finally, if a supplier can do it better than what we're able to improve upon, then we outsource. Now, throwing a monkey wrench into this decision process actually is regulatory. As you guys may have heard in the news, that the Trump administration recently blacklisted Huawei as a buyer of American telecommunications components. With Huawei, their entire make versus buy decision was that for strategically important components to their telecommunications equipment, their organization was not good at it. And as far as their processes are concerned, as much as they try to improve their existing process, they have not been able to improve at a rate that would allow them to insource. And that's the reason why Huawei purchases some $11 billion worth of components directly from US manufacturers. Now, when the Trump administration outright banned Huawei from being able to purchase these strategically important components, what it basically, the message that it is sending to Huawei is that this outsourcing option is no longer available, and it forces the company to improve its process in order to become strategically, in order for the company to become good at something that is strategically important as far as a component goes. So the question then becomes, if Huawei were to survive the Trump administration's ban and blacklisting, and that eventually they become good at something that they are banned from purchasing in the US, then Huawei suddenly becomes a strategic competitor against US companies. And so then there's a real concern of the Trump administration creating an international competitor with a highly diversified product portfolio to fund their strategic initiatives. And so with this purchasing process, oftentimes a buyer can be forced into a certain decision. And so depending on what you're buying, there's total cost of ownership analysis. With total cost of ownership, as I mentioned, I think we talked about it before in one of the earlier topics, in that you're not just paying the upfront cost here, but instead you're paying a combination of your fixed cost, so annual based on 1 million units a year, with your cost remaining if outsourced. So you're trying to do a cost-benefit analysis that, yes, I'm making something for my company at 59 cents per unit, but the total cost of ownership of plating machine parts is not as simple as comparing what I'm spending here versus how much it costs. But instead, with my decision of outsourcing, there are other aspects of it that, even though I have a fixed overhead reduction of, rather, if I have an overall cost reduction from outsourcing, of getting rid of my processing labor, plant costs, and materials, but what I have to pay in addition will be the part price itself. So a supplier may give me a quote of 42 cents per unit as compared to 59 cents per unit. It looks attractive, but the total cost of ownership, the TCO impact here is there's transportation cost, there's packaging cost, and then there's transportation cost back, and then the cost associated with inspection to make sure that they're actually adequately done, and that the total variable cost per unit is a lot higher than just the upfront purchase price because of all the other activities involved in order to ensure that what I'm ultimately receiving is comparable to what I manufacture for myself. And then we have sensitivity analysis. What if volume goes up or down significantly? With your basic econ knowledge, economies of scale comes in as well. What if we can use the plating space for something else? Opportunity cost. What additional risks does outsourcing create? So geopolitical risks are a huge thing now, especially with, just think about who do we not have a trade war against right now. We just recently lifted tariffs on steel coming from Canada and Mexico. They are still battling in trade war against Europe in the auto industry, and now we're at basically full-scale trade war against China. And so, under the current political climate, outsourcing has a lot of risks, and maybe that's part of it that's intentional, to create supply chain risks in order to encourage companies to locate domestically. And so that's why sensitivity analysis is so important, is that it allows you to understand what risks are there and start to anticipate these risks to come up with potential responses. So with sensitivity analysis, you tend to use total landed cost for standard buys. Standard buys are closely associated with routine buys. The reason why I care about total landed cost is because you care more about cost to market, not just a purchasing price, but you buy it, or you buy something, you get it transported, and you sell it. And total landed cost includes the cost of the goods purchased as well as the transportation cost. Now with capital acquisition cost, you want to look at the life cycle analysis. And so you would apply net present value in terms of the future benefit of a capital acquisition. Whereas standard buys are short-term and the time value of money is not as relevant, a capital acquisition tends to be multiple years. And so as a buyer, again, you want to conduct sensitivity analysis on scenarios beyond just transportation. What if the price of fuel goes up? With capital acquisition, you think about interest rate, you think about probability of obsolescence, useful years of useful life of the capital equipment, and so forth. So net present value plays a significant role here. And finally, if you're a buyer, how can you actually make a difference? There's a profit leverage effect. In your textbook, it basically describes to you that every single cent saved by the purchasing manager goes right to your bottom line. So a penny saved is a penny earned. In comparison, you need to generate a far higher level of sales in order to enjoy the same level of benefit. Also, as a purchaser, your social responsibility plays a major role. For instance, with Starbucks, Starbucks coffee buyers are basically the vanguard for making sure that the coffee beans they purchase are from farms that practice high levels of sustainability, such as in Rainforest Alliance, such as paying coffee farmers a livable wage. Part of the reason here is because with something like Coffee Farm, if you pay them too low, they would switch to a different crop that are more profitable. And then you lose the coffee farm and you shrink your own supply base. And if you shrink your own supply base, you're making your own supply base more complicated, more complex, and you give your other remaining suppliers greater bargaining leverage, and ultimately comes to greater financial harm than otherwise if you simply chose to pay a slightly higher wage. So in the end, being socially responsible is actually the ultimate economically sustainable thing to do. And finally, as a buyer, you look at you're ultimately serving your company as well as all the different functions within, and you need to build a team across different functions in order to make the optimal decision, because it kind of goes back to our very first couple of slides, where as a buyer, you're really trying to strike the balance within the 7 rights of purchasing. And having building a right team from different functions would allow a buyer to better understand the scope of his purchase decision. Okay. All right. Thank you all, and I will see you for topic 12.